When a serial killer is captured, there's an elite band of experts called upon by the police to help interview the deadliest category of murderer. Psychologists, psychiatrists, and profilers, they are men and women who have spent their entire working lives face to face with some of the most dangerous killers the world has ever known.
Too many similarities for the question not to be asked, and for you not to say why.
No comment.
No comment.
They paint the image that I was this monster who picked up like these altar boys along the street and swatted them like flies. I said, this is ludicrous.
I am sorry for all the pain that my actions have caused. I am prepared to die if you say it is necessary.
After working for decades intimately with the most violent people alive, our experts have developed the skills to protect themselves.
If you don't distance yourself, it will get to you over time.
I do not want some of the stuff going through their minds to be running around inside mine.
Every time that you are called upon to do it, you have to take a deep breath and you have to go back into that darkness.
Now, for the first time, these experts have come together to see if there are any common factors in the lives of serial killers that have pushed seemingly ordinary men and women to commit this most heinous of crimes.
I don't believe anyone is born a serial killer.
We need to know the motivation and what they're getting out of it.
What's feeding their fetishes?
Lack of love, lack of family bonding, lack of affection, punishment.
Could these combined factors reach a breaking point that could push the individual over the edge and help us understand what it takes to make a monster?
Serial killing is the malign waste product of a dysfunctional culture.
To me, Aileen Wuornos' story is really quite a tragic tale of somebody who went from disadvantage and trying to survive to increasing belligerence, eventual counterattack, and finally, in prison, it seems, a degree of paranoia.
I think the fascination comes firstly because she's a woman, and female serial killers are extraordinarily rare, but she was also a predatory serial killer.
This was both a vulnerable, misunderstood woman and a vicious, driven serial killer.
I believe it was, in every sense of the word, a tragedy.
On December the 1st, 1989, police in Florida discovered an abandoned vehicle belonging to a local man called Richard Mallory. Mallory was nowhere to be seen. 12 days later, a missing persons investigation turned into one for murder. Richard Mallory's body had been found lying in a woodland. He'd been shot multiple times. The police had no idea who the killer was, least of all that the killer was a woman. A woman by the name of Aileen Wuornos.
She described it as an incident where she was out working as a prostitute to make money, to support herself, and that she did what she was supposed to do. She said if he had just paid me, that would have been the end of it. But then he wanted me to do something kinky, is how she put it. And I wasn't going to allow anything like that to happen. I wasn't going to do anything like that. And that is how his murder occurred.
When Aileen Wuornos was captured a year and 5 murders later, she insisted the murder of Mallory was self-defense. But her story would vary wildly during her period in custody, meaning it was impossible to know what had really happened on that fateful day. But one thing is certain, the murder of Mallory set Aileen Wuornos on the path to becoming a serial killer.
It was uncovered during the trial that he was a sex offender. I believe he had served time in a New York prison for various sexual offenses, but that information was not allowed during that particular trial
The first person that she killed was a risk to her, a real risk. She meets a client who seems to want to take everything from her without meeting his side of the transaction, and perhaps representing a physical risk to her as well, and she kills him. I mean, you have to ask, how did she come to have the weapon? How did she come to use it? Why does it take so long to actually kill him? So there are elements of question in there. But once that happens, she kills another 5 or 6 people, and always in the same way, robbery is always involved.
And in the space of a year, she killed 7 men. And she did it deliberately and premeditatedly and consciously. And she did it because she was enjoying it and she was taking her revenge on men. And she did it for profit because she was robbing all of her victims. This wasn't a kind of justice retaliation for her. This was her taking her vengeance and her profit motive to the extreme.
In 1991, Aileen Wuornos found herself in Volusia County Jail, charged with multiple murders. She agreed to allow her defense team to send a psychologist to evaluate her mental state. Unless they could paint her as a sympathetic character and offer an explanation for her crimes, her defense knew she was facing the death penalty in Florida. Forensic psychologist Dr. Jeffrey Dahmer was the man assigned to the killer the press was now calling the damsel of death.
I first became involved in that particular case in the 1980s. I was contacted by one of her attorneys, and it was requested that I come in to provide an account of her developmental history, her psychological development, and whether or not there was some relationship between her developmental history and her behavior leading up to and including the charges she was facing. When I first met her, the thing that stood out to me was that she was very, very fragile. And she had this kind of facade that she presented to mask that vulnerability, that insecurity. As she began to talk and to describe what had happened to her over her lifetime, you would begin to see the vulnerability and why it was that she wound up in this kind of cycle that she couldn't get out of. As she attempted to get what she wanted, she wound up making herself more vulnerable and then being exploited, and then once again re-experiencing what she was trying to escape to start with.
Once Dr. Dahmer had won Aileen Wuornos' confidence, in a bid to trace her development as a serial killer, he began by taking her all the way back to her childhood, growing up in Troy, Michigan. A childhood that was filled with many traumatic episodes.
We began the exploration with her earliest recollection. And she said to me that she remembers her mother telling her when she was very young that she tried to abort but was unsuccessful. And from that point, most of what she said to me was negative. The environment that she described, the people that she described, the experiences that she had were all negative from that point on.
Unwanted and quickly abandoned by her mother, Aileen's lack of self-worth and self-esteem from an early age saw her descend into drug abuse and depravity before she reached her teens. Dr. Eric Cullen was one of the UK's leading prison psychologists and a founder of the only therapeutic unit for psychopaths in Britain. He has studied the case of Aileen Wuornos closely, and like Dr. Jethro Dahmer, believes her genesis as a serial killer may be traced back to her traumatic childhood.
She had an absolutely dreadful childhood, really one of the worst I've ever read. Her parents were divorced before she was born. Her father was a schizophrenic, imprisoned child molester who killed himself in prison. Her mother rejected her and abandoned her and her brother when she was 4 and left them in the tender mercies of her grandfather. Her grandfather abused her, sexually abused her, bullied her, had an accomplice of his rape her when she was still a child.
In addition to the fact that she reports being sexually molested by her grandfather, she also reported that she had slept with her brother. She said that she just wanted someone to hold her in terms of just the human contact and the human warmth and what have you that she missed.
Any sexual abuse in childhood is very, very potentially damaging in development. There is no doubt at all that can feed into the need for whether it's killing or it's raping or it's arson or whatever like that. Her father was a convicted rapist of a 7-year-old girl and died in jail by his own hand. Grandfather was a drunk who molested her and would get her to strip all her clothes off. And the business of some of the bodies being discovered naked or nearly naked could quite likely be related to her grandfather ordering her to strip. And I think it's all interwoven, feeding in. And it really is a case of, you bastards, I'm going to get my revenge.
Before she had even reached her teenage years, Aileen Wuornos began to view her body as a commodity and a means of winning small freedoms from her oppressive home life.
From the age of 10 onwards, she was having sexual activity with the local boys almost indiscriminately for as little as a packet of cigarettes or something like that. And she quickly made the link between how to use sex to get money. But of course, that quickly meant that they treated her with contempt. So on all fronts, she's had terrible experiences of being treated by men with zero respect and exploitation.
Her grandfather made her life so difficult, and that for her and her brother, that she was actually driven from home by the time she was 15, and she ended up living in the woods. As nothing much more than a child, but she was already a child who had been introduced to the horrors of life, and she was already prostituting. And that set the stage for her entire life.
There were all these factors that simply were representative of the dysfunction that surrounded her and this kind of almost crucible of despair that was building as she progressed and as she grew.
The isolation that Aileen Wuornos experienced pushed her deeper into her own world and began to twist her view of normality and stunted her mental development.
In order for individuals to develop a consistent pattern of behaving and thinking, there are 3 things that are critical in their developmental years: stability, predictability, safety. If you have the situation such as Aileen Wuornos had, your energy is all devoted primarily to one thing: surviving.
She knows she's in a position of low status and vulnerability, but things like self-esteem and a genuine sense of connectedness with others, those are going to be very difficult in that kind of circumstance.
Wuornos' complete disconnect from the real world was characterized by her inability to ever hold down a job for more than a few days. She would always quarrel with her bosses and quit, leaving her to return to the only means she knew of earning a living: sex work. Eventually feeling tired and alienated in her home state of Michigan, Wuornos decided to head south to make a new start. In 1976, 20-year-old Aileen hitchhiked to Florida. And at first, her luck seemed to change. She met a 69-year-old businessman, Louis Fell, who became infatuated with the colorful, gregarious young woman, much to the shock and surprise of his family. Soon they married, but the honeymoon period was to be very short-lived.
The marriage lasted precisely 9 weeks when her violence and outbursts at various bars and places became uncontrollable and he wasn't able to do anything about it. Very much a sugar daddy sort of relationship, until eventually she hit him with his own cane, and that was the last straw, so he had the marriage annulled.
Following the failure of the marriage, Aileen once again found herself out on the street, and she turned to the only means of work she knew to support herself: prostitution and petty crime. She worked the freeways and bars of Florida, scraping a living and getting into frequent scrapes with the law. But she always carried a weapon to protect herself.
She was involved in carrying guns from an early age. She was involved in robbing people, in armed robbery. She carried handguns and ammunition for much of her life. And she did that partly because it was protection. She was a road prostitute, and that's a very risky proposition, where she was being picked up and very much rough trade prostitution from strangers. And that's where she lived her life.
I think it signified that she was looking for an escape of some kind. So throughout her life, she'd been treated terribly by the people around her, especially the male figures, and she'd learnt to view herself as as nothing, really, to disassociate herself from her body, from her feelings, and almost accept that she was going to be controlled and dominated and humiliated by those around her, because that's all she'd experienced growing up. And indeed, it may have been in her eyes, she was hoping for some sort of fairy tale, that one of these encounters would result in the happy ending.
In 1986, this rootless existence would find some meaning when Wuornos met a young woman called Tyra Moore. The two women almost instantly began a relationship, with Wuornos later describing Moore as the love of her life.
She was looking for something, and she met Miss Moore. And she saw Tyra as the person who would provide some acceptance, some validation. And so she was willing to go out and do whatever in order to get money so that they could survive and function.
Yet, in a remarkable twist, instead of providing stability, the entire duration of their relationship would encapsulate Wuornos' career as a serial killer. But how could this have been? Professor Paul Britton has worked as a psychologist for over 40 years. He believes the relationship with Moore may have been key in giving Wuornos what she perceived to be a license to kill.
What is it that makes people become killers? Well, we know that the processing of aggression and sexual interest often get mixed up together. And I think when this happens, you have someone who is on the way to being a serial killer, where they get the return from hurting and controlling someone else.
From Moore, Wuornos was finally getting the love and affection she craved. To keep the relationship intact, she knew she would need to fulfill her violent fantasies elsewhere, on her clients. In effect, she would need to lead a double life.
So it's perfectly possible for someone to have sexual pleasure in consensual relationships or not have sexual relationships at all, but they prefer to go in this other way. They become, not in the true sense, another person, but they begin to inhabit another fantasy world where, rather like playing a computer game, they can pretend that they are someone else, that they have certain sorts of control.
She had a hatred for men, and specifically men who bought sex from her. It was very localized and very personal. I don't think she had a hatred of all men who bought sex from prostitutes. Prostitutes live and die without killing any clients. The thing with Wuornos is that she carried a hatred of men. Prostitutes don't always carry a murderous hatred of men. She was taking her revenge at a particular time in her life where she was also profit motivated. She had two lives to support, hers and her lover's.
She once said that she had a hatred of humankind, but that's not quite true. It was much more a hatred of mankind.
Once she'd killed her first victim, Richard Mallory, in December 1989, Wuornos' appetite for killing ran wild. She was also clever enough to know that if she were to continue murdering, she needed to develop an MO and to nurture a safe environment in which she was confident she could seduce her victims and dispose of them without fear of detection. Dr. Samantha Lundrigan is the UK's leading geographic profiler. She assists the police in creating murder maps in serial murder investigations, providing clues about where a killer may have lived, played, and worked, based on where the body of a victim had been found.
Highways were central to her offending career. She used them for her work, where she picked up men for her prostitution, and ultimately she used them to select her victims. And she likely had thousands of encounters along those highways, only a few of which ended up resulting in murder. But that was her legitimate way to pick up her victims. And the different locations served different purposes. She needed to be visible on the highway to pick up her victims. But then, of course, once she's in a vehicle with a potential victim, in order to commit the crime, then she needed to find a different location that would afford her the opportunity to do that. And the perfect places for those were secluded environments, just off the highways usually, but where there was no chance of witnesses passing by, and she could carry out the crime and then also get away from that crime, usually in the offender's vehicle, undetected.
After the killing of Mallory, to Wuornos, subsequent victims were nameless, faceless vessels for her rage. In a period of just 6 months, Wuornos killed 3 more men using an almost identical MO.
She was first and foremost selecting on the basis of the vehicle, because you know that's what she saw first, and making an assumption about the type of person that may be in that. And of course the people that would stop for her would have been males ordinarily, and so she was looking for the types of vehicles that she would associate with the types of victims that she was targeting, the types of men that she had hatred for, and also perhaps making a judgment on perhaps how much financially she might be able to gain from the crime.
Home Office pathologist Dr. Richard Shepherd believes each subsequent murder was a form of deadly calling card and a warning to other men.
From the pathologist's point of view, there are clearly a number of similar jigsaw pieces in these cases. You know, the use of cars, the use of a gun, the presence of a situation out in an open space, the abandonment of the car a distance away, all these things chime and make a point, because killers get into a habit. They find a way that it works for them. They have a modus operandi. And as a result, they tend to follow it because it works. They know it works.
With the body count rising, the police were still completely ignorant of who the culprit was, or even that a woman could be capable of the crimes. Wuornos was literally getting away with murder. But why was Wuornos killing, and killing again? Dr. Jethro Dahmer, who interviewed her multiple times, believes her inbuilt survival instinct may have played a part.
There are all kinds of opinions about whether she was raped, whether she wasn't. Some reports say that she said that she was, and then at other times she said that she wasn't, what have you. I believe that what transpired was that she experienced behavior on the part of the individuals that triggered in her the instinct for survival. I don't know exactly what that particular thing was, except that in her mind, it represented something that required her to take steps in order to survive. What she was doing was protecting herself. That's how she saw it. She saw herself once again being devalued, being maligned by an individual, and in this particular instance, she was protecting herself.
But alongside surviving, could it be that Wuornos was also by now, like many serial killers, killing for kicks, with a growing sense of pleasure at the heart of the matter?
I think it was a release, and I think she really enjoyed the emotional release of finally being able to kill someone that she would rationalize as a tormentor. But she had chosen to be a prostitute. She had chosen to go out onto those roads. She had chosen to take money from the men to allow them to have sex with her. She made those choices, consciously aware of what she was doing. This particular one, it could have happened earlier, it could have happened later. He was the key one. Once she experienced it, she enjoyed it. And she enjoyed that power and that revenge and that dominance. The ones after the first one were simply her repeating that extremely pleasurable release of anger and dominance.
Pleasure is such a difficult word in this context. I have the sense that it satisfied something in her psyche at that time, maybe a feeling of being dominated. She pushed back against that sense of being dominated, that feeling of being used, and she pushed back against that. Maybe there was something particular that these people said that chimed back to her childhood. I see it much more as a response to that than that she was gaining direct and immediate pleasure from doing it. It was her kickback.
The blood rush of pleasure and satisfaction Wuornos experienced from killing the men fed into an even greater reason for wanting to repeat the sensation. For the first time in her life, it gave her power over men who she felt had always wronged her, and an ability to rectify that wrong by dictating whether they lived or died.
I think maybe she saw them as prey, and in fact, again, it's all about control. And interestingly, the choice of weapon is interesting, because she had a gun, which a lot of serial killers don't choose that as a weapon of choice. They want to get more up close and personal and, you know, choose strangulation or stabbing, for example, but she chose a gun because that signified absolute power and control. There was no issue around imbalance in strength, for example. She knew she was in control and she could hunt them down, really, in many respects.
She was a lady, in a sense, with no power in many aspects of her life. But to have a gun gives the person holding the gun a huge amount of power and control over the situation. You know, a gun can be used by someone who doesn't have a lot of strength. It's a powerful weapon that can be used over a great distance. And so particularly for a woman, maybe, there is no need to overpower, there's no need to restrain, there's no need to control directly. You can use the gun at any range to cause the death. And multiple gunshots in the back really indicate that she was taking an even more cowardly way out by shooting someone when they weren't aware of what was going on. And then she would often shoot them in the head as well, just to make sure that they were dead.
By January 1991, Aileen Wuornos had murdered 6 men. Police had no idea who the killer was, much less that she was a woman. Yet Wuornos was caught not through great detective work, but by making a foolish mistake. She was caught abandoning a vehicle that had belonged to her final known victim, Walter Antonio. Despite being presented with a growing body of evidence stacked against her, Wuornos refused to cooperate, even when shown the wall of pictures that was made up of the faces of the men she was suspected of killing. Detectives made a highly controversial move. They tracked down Wuornos' lover, Tyra Moore. They threatened Moore with cold conspiracy to murder. But in return for her freedom, they insisted she use the power she still wielded over Wuornos to entrap her into giving a confession. A phone call between the 2 women was arranged, and as Moore called Wuornos in prison, police officers stood by, recording every word of the phone call. This is their actual conversation.
Hey, Ty?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Nothing. What the hell are you doing?
Nothing. I'm sitting here in jail.
Yeah, it's what I heard. There's been officials up at my parents' house asking some questions.
Uh-oh.
And I'm getting scared.
I think what happened, there was pictures in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a case of mistaken identity.
I don't know whether I should keep on living or if I should...
No, Tyler.
What?
You go ahead and let us know what you need to know. If you want to know anything, you're innocent. Listen, if I have to confess, I will.
The fateful phone conversation would condemn Wuornos for the murders, and perhaps worse than that, destroy any fragment of respect she still may have held for humanity.
This is the interesting thing, because when they taped the telephone calls between Moore and Wuornos, Moore had been given an exemption from prosecution if she tried to extract some form of confession. It would appear that Wuornos became increasingly conscious that something wasn't right and was asking questions along the lines of, are you on your own there? Are you on your own there? And Moore tried to sort of smooth things over. And what it would seem, and this is where it is interesting, is that she showed considerable loyalty towards the end in making confessions which exonerated Moore. So there was clearly a close bond between the two of them.
In those conversations, it was clear that Ms. Wuornos would do anything to protect Ms. Moore in terms of even confessing to everything.
The day after the phone call, Wuornos asked to see the detectives working her case.
She hands herself into a situation where she eventually accepts responsibility for these killings, where she could have argued that it wasn't her, in order that she didn't involve her lover.
The reason I'm confessing is there's not another girl. There is one girl. I'm telling you from the bottom of my heart, I'm telling you the truth about everything. I mean, I can't be any truthful. I just want to let them understand that Tyra is very innocent. I don't want an innocent person hurt.
That was an incredibly wounding experience for Wuornos, but by that time she was already beyond any redemption or reclamation as a human.
But our experts believe that Wuornos' motivations and apparent reason for confessing shouldn't necessarily be mistaken for compassion or self-sacrifice. Throughout her life, Wuornos had displayed psychopathic and narcissistic traits, and the act of making herself seem like more of a savior may have been an example of these in action. Dr. Jeffrey Dahmer spent many hours interviewing Aileen Wuornos. This is the first time he's studied her confession closely. Does it really portray her as a martyr?
Sociopaths don't show compassion. Everything is towards their own gratification and what meets their needs. And you can see from that relationship that if somebody showed her just the slightest validation, acceptance, if they legitimized her in any way, you would have support, because that's what she's so desperately seeking and why she wanted so desperately to reciprocate.
What seems to be happening in this case is not empathy. Empathy means feeling with someone, feeling as though you were in their position, in their shoes. And I don't think she ever had the capacity for doing that. I think that what she is much more likely to have had is a relationship, someone that she valued, someone that seemed to give back to her a sense of self-worth, of value, of love that she could find nowhere else. And for that, the preservation of that, she was willing to sacrifice herself.
I wish I never got that gun. I wish the guy never let him off of her. I just wish I never would have done what I did.
At some level, she understands what was going on. On the other side, though, she couldn't respond otherwise, because she was simply responding in a way that was true and consistent with her mental illness. So while on one hand, in terms of a thought process, I shouldn't have done this, I shouldn't have done that, while that is going on at the same time, her deficits in terms of her mental illness will not let her behave in a way that's consistent with her thought process. And that is a constant that operates in all individuals. They think and they know what they should do, but they do something else.
A year after her arrest in January 1991, Wuornos went on trial for the murder of Richard Mallory. Medical experts, including Dr. Jeffrey Dahmer, testified that amongst other conditions, Wuornos was suffering from borderline personality disorder.
Consensus view of borderline personality, also known as BPD, is that it originates from a lack of attachment and consistent parenting, which of course is very readily characterized by Wuornos's upbringing, particularly in the first 5 years of life. The term has its origins on being on the cusp of being psychotic, where you're completely out with reality, and neurotic, where you've got problems but you're still in touch with reality. So in no way is it to be interpreted as somehow modest or minor. In fact, it's one of the most serious disorders and is characterized by them changing in terms of mental stability, sometimes up, sometimes down, totally different with different people at different times and the same people at different times. You never know where you are with them.
I am sorry for all the pain that my actions have caused.
Wuornos's borderline personality disorder could clearly be seen in full flight during her many court appearances.
You get a different person almost every time. In some instances, I would come to see her and she would be rational, coherent, and responsive. Other times I would come and she would refuse to see me. Another time I would come and she would talk about how bad her representation was, that her attorneys were going to sell her down the river, that I was in cahoots with her attorneys to sell her down the river. And then other times she would talk about how appreciative she was to have the attorneys who seemed to be working hard on her case.
The main challenge is to constantly disbelieve anything that you're hearing and taking it at face value, because the borderline personality disordered individuals are absolute masters of deception and can put on the most convincing performance, and you have to be very, very wary indeed about what you're being fed in terms of answers.
During her many police interviews and trial appearances, Wuornos made a number of damning statements that revealed much about her motivation to kill. Perhaps none more so than this one.
I want to quote the statement that she made when she'd already been convicted. I robbed them and killed them as cold as ice, and I'd do it again, because I've hated humans for a long time. I'm guilty as can be, and there's more. I'm a serial killer.
I want to come clean and tell the world I killed those men first degree. Robbed and killed and keep many witnesses.
It's not uncommon for people to try and pretend that they have a conscience and being honest about their crimes for the first time in order to get some form of easier regime, etc. The only other thing I can think is that such was her deep-seated hatred of men that she wanted to come right on out and say she'd done it not out of self-defense but because the horrible men deserved it.
Wuornos's trial gripped the world, and after 2 weeks, on January the 27th, the jury delivered their verdict. After less than 2 hours' deliberation, they came back unanimously. Wuornos was guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of Richard Mallory. The recommendation being she be sent to the electric chair. Dr. Jethro Dahmer recalls his shock at the verdict.
The primary interest was in convicting someone for the crime. There did not seem to be a great deal of interest in understanding who this person was if she spoke out of turn in court, or if there was some incident involving elevated or agitated mood that would be looked upon as, see, here's this person who is engaging in this behavior, and this is the same person that killed those men. The emphasis seemed to be on how do we take a piece of information out of context and use it to paint a picture of this person, as opposed to looking at the total individual.
A further series of trials followed, where Wuornos's behavior would become increasingly erratic. Eventually, she would be convicted of 5 other murders and given another 5 death sentences. But did she really deserve to die for her crimes, given her tumultuous past?
I think it's really part of the tragedy of Aileen's case that, yes, she was executed. And she had been a victim, she had been brutalized. So society had failed her. And rather than be accorded any sort of sympathy that we might normally with somebody who's been a victim, she was executed. Arguably, she was suffering effects of trauma. And with that would have come, in her case, probably a sense of distrust and having to fight against feelings of worthlessness, having to live with her perceptions of how society saw her. And she was somebody who doesn't seem to have had much support, affection, tenderness in her life. And a lot of her life seems to have been spent in a rather desperate survival sort of mode. So there does seem to be something rather ironic in executing somebody in her circumstances.
I believe it was, in every sense of the word, a tragedy. She was mentally ill, and she had demonstrated that mental illness almost from the very beginning. A woman who was mentally ill was executed. The last time I saw her, my sense was that she had almost given up, that she was not willing to put forth any additional energy, that she was just going to let whatever happened, happen. When I heard that she had been executed, I remember thinking to myself, what a waste. Here was a person who was mentally ill, and her mental illness became progressively worse as time went on. And the focus was on the execution, and not a great deal of attention was given to her mental state.
Aileen Wuornos is perhaps the most controversial serial killer in history, whose crimes truly continue to divide popular opinion. But the question remains, had Aileen Wuornos had a stable and a loving upbringing, would she really have gone on to become a serial killer?
For all of us, without exception, we need to be protected as children. We need to be loved and nurtured and safe. And she had the exact opposite of that, and many serial killers do. This is one of the key contributing factors to serial killing, that they are abused when they should have been protected and loved. And not just abused, they are raped, they are rejected, and that is a betrayal of the first primary trust. Trust in parents, trust in guardians. And you can never redeem that completely. It sets in place in their hearts and minds that they can't trust, and they will be betrayed, and they are vulnerable.
The idea of monster is what you get when individuals cherry pick data. In psychology, we look at the totality of the data. And if you look at the totality of the data, with respect to Aileen Wuornos, monster is not an appropriate term. You have an individual who was motivated and functioning based upon her own deficits. She was operating in the only way that she knew how.